They threw him out like trash. Now he's back to destroy them. The rain was relentless that night. Cold, merciless, the kind that seeped into your bones, turning your skin to ice and your breath to mist. Somewhere in the darkness, a man lay on the pavement, his body beaten, his pride shattered, his name spat on like it meant nothing. His clothes were soaked, clinging to him like the last remnants of dignity he had left. His fingers trembled as they reached for the only thing that mattered. His knives, now scattered in the mud, just like him. Malik Langston had walked into that restaurant as a chef. He had left as a nobody. They hadn't just fired him. They had erased him. They laughed as they threw him out, their voices dripping with mockery. They thought they had won. To them, he was just another fool who didn't know his place. A black man in a world where power belonged to people who looked nothing like him. But here's the thing about people like that. They never see the fall coming. Because Malik Langston wasn't just some nameless worker. He wasn't a nobody. He was the man who had built that very kitchen, designed every menu, chosen every damn ingredient. He owned that restaurant. And now he was coming back. Not as a worker, not as a beggar, but as their worst nightmare. Do you think they'll get what's coming to them? Will Malik's revenge be enough? Smash that like button, subscribe, and comment below where you're watching from. The golden glow of La Maison Royale spilled onto the pavement, its grand entrance bustling with arriving guests. Luxury cars pulled up, valets in crisp uniforms opened doors, and elegantly dressed patrons strode inside, ready to indulge in the finest cuisine the city had to offer. Malik Langston stood just outside that world, invisible to it. Clutching his knife roll, he approached the entrance, his worn sneakers making little sound against the polished stone steps. The weight of the knives inside was familiar, comforting in a way, though tonight it offered no security. A figure shifted into his path. Travis Holt, head of security, planted himself between Malik and the door. Arms crossed, legs spread wide, a smirk curling the edges of his mouth. "Lost, buddy?" Travis drawled, scanning Malik up and down like he was something that had crawled in from the gutter. Malik stopped short, swallowing down the immediate discomfort that rose in his chest. "I work here," he said evenly. Travis raised an eyebrow. "That so?" His smirk deepened, voice thick with amusement. "You got a delivery or something?" His gaze flicked to the knife roll, then back to Malik's face, as if daring him to say otherwise. "I'm a chef," Malik said, gripping the strap tighter. Travis let out a short, sharp laugh. A few guests near the entrance turned their heads at the sound, intrigued by the unfolding spectacle. "A chef?" Travis repeated, as if the very idea was absurd. He shook his head. "Nah, I know the kitchen staff. And trust me, you're not one of them." Malik's pulse ticked at his temple, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Check the list," he said. "My name is..." Travis stepped forward, closing the distance, his smirk twisting into something crueler. "I don't give a damn what your name is," he said. "What I do know is that you don't belong here." A few feet away, a valet paused mid-step, eyes darting between them before quickly looking away. A well-dressed couple near the entrance whispered among themselves, sneaking glances but making no move to intervene. Malik tried again, his voice quieter now, less sure. "I just need to..." Travis's hand shot out, pressing hard against Malik's chest, stopping him mid-step. "You really don't get it, do you?" Travis said, voice dropping just enough that only Malik could hear the venom in it. "You don't belong." Then, before Malik could react, Travis reached down, snatched the knife roll from his hand, and flung it onto the ground. The leather case hit the pavement hard, the buckle snapping open, steel flashing under the restaurant's golden lights. The sound of metal against stone rang sharp and final. Knives tumbled out, scattering in all directions. For a moment, silence settled over the scene. Even the distant hum of the city seemed to fade. A sharp gasp came from somewhere nearby. The valet shifted uncomfortably, clearly debating whether to step in, but thought better of it. The couple by the door hesitated, then continued inside, choosing to ignore the scene entirely. Travis chuckled, stepping back. "Oops." Malik's breath came shallow. His fingers curled, every instinct screaming at him to react. But he couldn't. The air around him felt heavier as the humiliation set in, pressing against his ribs, hot and suffocating. He crouched down. One by one, he picked up the knives, carefully sliding each blade back into its slot. His hands were steady, but his chest burned. Travis stood over him, watching with a satisfied grin. "That's right. Pick up your trash." A chuckle came from one of the valets. A guest, now inside but still watching through the glass doors, smirked and whispered something to his companion. The shame settled deep, wrapping around Malik's throat like a vice. He finished gathering the knives, fastened the leather roll shut, and stood. He didn't meet Travis's eyes this time. He just turned, stepping away from the entrance, the weight of unseen stares clinging to his back. Behind him, La Maison Royale continued as if he had never existed. The kitchen of La Maison Royale was a world of motion, steam rising in thick clouds, flames licking at the edges of blackened pans, the sharp percussion of knives striking wooden boards. Heat clung to every surface, saturating the air with the scent of butter, garlic, and charred meat. Malik Langston slipped through the back entrance, his damp clothes still clinging to him from the night air. He moved quickly, past crates of produce stacked near the doorway, past dishwashers bent over deep sinks. He hadn't made it more than a few steps before a voice cut through the noise. "The hell are you doing here?" Every movement in the kitchen slowed. Someone turned down a burner. A cook stopped mid-chop. The low hum of conversation dipped into silence as heads turned toward him. Owen Delacroix stood near the pass, a towel slung over his shoulder, brow furrowing as he took in Malik's presence. The pause lasted only a second before irritation flickered across his face. He didn't recognize him, not as anyone important, just someone who didn't belong. Malik opened his mouth to speak, but Owen was already moving. He crossed the room in a few quick strides, his boots heavy against the tiled floor. Before Malik could react, a hand slammed against his chest, shoving him backward. Malik stumbled, his shoulder colliding with a stainless steel counter. A stack of metal trays clattered to the floor. The sharp noise cut through the silence like a gunshot. A few gasps, a few muffled laughs. No one stepped in. Owen sneered. Somebody order a damn delivery, or did a stray just wander in? Scattered chuckles spread across the kitchen. A sous chef smirked as he wiped his hands on his apron. A pastry chef near the ovens hid a grin behind the back of his hand. Malik caught himself against the counter, forcing down the burning in his chest. Before he could finish, something cold and wet crashed against his chest. The shock made him freeze. It took a second to process what had happened. The stench hit him first: spoiled food, grease, detergent. A bucket of dishwater had been thrown at him, soaking through his clothes, clinging to his skin like filth that couldn't be wiped away. Laughter erupted, louder now. Not just from Owen, but from the entire kitchen. A sous chef near the grill bent over, clutching his stomach. A dishwasher covered his mouth, shoulders shaking. The cooks, who had hesitated before, were now fully enjoying the show. Malik had become the joke of the night. Owen grinned, stepping back to admire his handiwork. "Hell, now you smell like you belong here." Malik stood there, motionless. The dishwater dripped from his sleeves, his collar, sliding down his back in slow, disgusting rivulets. The laughter rang in his ears, but he couldn't move. If he wiped at his face, they'd laugh harder. If he spoke, they'd twist his words into something pathetic. A rag landed at his feet. "Might want to clean yourself up," someone snickered. The kitchen was waiting, watching. Would he react? Would he lash out? Would he fight back? He bent down, picked up the rag, and wiped his hands. The amusement faded slightly. A few people had wanted him to break. Owen clicked his tongue in mock disappointment. Smart boy. Malik's hands clenched around the damp fabric, the sour smell making his stomach turn. The weight of 100 unseen gazes pressed against his skin, squeezing the air from his lungs. He wanted to disappear, to sink into the floor, to be anywhere but here. But there was no leaving. This was where he had to stay. The laughter had died down, but the humiliation remained. No one told him to get out. No one needed to. He had been put in his place. Owen turned back to his station, muttering something to a sous chef. The kitchen moved on as if nothing had happened. Malik stayed where he was, dishwater still dripping from his sleeves. The damp rag hung useless in his grip. The heat of the kitchen pressed in on him, suffocating, heavy. He swallowed hard and forced himself to step forward. The night had just begun. The kitchen settled back into its rhythm, the brief amusement at Malik's expense fading into the background noise of clattering pans and shouted orders. He stood there, still damp from the dishwater, his shirt clinging to his skin, the stench of grease and spoiled food curling in his nose. No one acknowledged him. No one offered him a towel. The message had been clear. He was at the bottom, and he would stay there. A voice snapped him out of his thoughts. "You still standing around for a reason?" Malik turned to see Gordon, one of the line cooks, holding a basket of vegetables. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his tone, mocking, dismissive. "You want to work, or you want to be a damn statue?" Malik forced his feet to move. Leaving wasn't an option. Neither was arguing. He took the basket without a word, moving toward the prep station where the other cooks were stationed. He wasn't given a cutting board, wasn't given space. He had to carve out his own. The tension thickened around him. He could feel eyes flicking in his direction, waiting for him to make a mistake, to give them another reason to laugh. His hands, usually steady, felt heavier than usual as he reached for a knife. He adjusted his grip, focusing on the smooth surface of the vegetables beneath his fingers. A loud clang shattered his concentration. A sauté pan, filled with boiling oil, hit the floor barely an inch from his foot. The hot liquid splattered, sizzling as it met the tile. Malik jumped back instinctively, the heat licking dangerously close to his ankle. Gasps rippled through the room. A few chuckles followed. "Shit," the cook, who had dropped the pan, muttered, not sounding the least bit apologetic. He smirked as he knelt to retrieve it. "Damn slippery hands." Malik's pulse pounded against his ribs. His skin still felt warm from the near miss, the acrid scent of burnt oil burning his nose. No one scolded the cook. No one asked if Malik was all right. The moment passed like it was nothing, the kitchen shifting back to work, as if he had nearly been burned alive for nothing more than entertainment. The prep station suddenly felt smaller. His shoulders tensed as he reached for his knife again. He had to work. He had to focus. A hand clamped down on his shoulder. He barely had time to register the force before he was shoved forward. His hands shot out to catch himself, but the sudden movement sent the knife in his grip sliding forward, the blade barely missing his fingers. Laughter erupted. "Careful, man," the cook behind him said, patting his back like they were old friends. "Wouldn't want you to lose a hand. Bad enough you barely know how to use it." Malik straightened, his chest rising and falling faster than before. The weight of his knife felt different now, less like a tool, more like a trap waiting to betray him. Across the room, Owen watched, arms crossed, amusement clear on his face. No one told them to stop. Malik knew they wouldn't. The kitchen moved at its usual, relentless pace, but Malik felt the weight of every glance in his direction. He had been shoved, nearly burned, and forced to endure humiliation in silence. No one had told him to leave, yet every action made it clear that he wasn't wanted. The only thing keeping him here was the fact that they hadn't physically thrown him out. "Think you can handle soup duty?" Gordon's voice cut through the noise. He stood by the stove, arms crossed, watching Malik with amusement. Malik gave a quick nod. Arguing would be pointless. Gordon stepped aside, motioning toward the massive stock pot simmering on the burner. The rich aroma of herbs and slow-cooked meat filled the air. It was nearly finished, just needing a final balance of seasoning. Malik grabbed a spoon, tasted the broth, then reached for the salt. He turned away for less than 5 seconds. When he looked back, something felt off. The color was the same, but the smell had changed. He took another taste, and his stomach twisted. Too much salt. Not a mistake. Someone had done this on purpose. His grip on the spoon tightened. He could already hear the reaction before it happened. This wasn't salvageable. No matter what he said, this failure would be his. Owen's voice rang out before Malik could even attempt to fix it. "You done screwing around over there, or do I need to come taste it myself?" Malik didn't respond, but Owen was already moving. He grabbed the ladle from Malik's hand and took a sip. Immediately, he spat it onto the floor, face contorting in exaggerated disgust. "Jesus Christ, what the hell is this?" His voice was loud enough for everyone to hear, carrying over the kitchen noise like a blade slicing through flesh. Malik barely had time to inhale before Owen reached for the pot. In one swift motion, he lifted it from the burner and dumped the entire batch onto the floor. Hot broth splashed across the tiles, spreading rapidly. Some of it hit Malik's shoes, burning through the thin material, but he didn't move. He stood frozen as the liquid pooled around his feet. Laughter erupted, sharp and cruel. Someone near the grill let out a low whistle. A pastry chef leaned against the counter, shaking his head in mock disappointment. "Since you screwed it up," Owen said, voice flat and cutting, "you can clean it up." He shoved a mop into Malik's chest. The wooden handle dug into his ribs, but he didn't react. His fingers closed around it, knuckles white from the force of his grip. He knew better than to hesitate. As he crouched down, knees pressing into the mess on the floor, Owen leaned in, his voice just low enough for only Malik to hear. "This isn't a place for screw-ups," he murmured. "If you can't keep up, you don't belong." Malik focused on the mop in his hands. His skin still burned from the heat of the broth, but it was nothing compared to the weight pressing against his chest. His arms moved mechanically, pushing the mop across the floor as the kitchen returned to work around him. The broth had been wiped from the floor, but the filth remained clinging to Malik's skin. His hands were raw from gripping the mop too tightly, his knees aching from kneeling on the hard tiles. The kitchen had returned to its usual chaos, and no one spared him a second glance. "Hope you didn't think you were done." Gordon's voice cut through the air, sharp and mocking. He stood by the prep station, a raw steak dangling between his fingers. "Come here." Malik hesitated, but he knew better than to refuse. He forced his legs to move, stopping just short of the counter. "Look at this," Gordon continued, holding up the steak. The cut was expensive, marbled with perfect lines of fat. "Damn shame when food gets wasted." "Huh." Before Malik could react, Gordon let the meat slip from his fingers. It hit the floor with a sickening slap. Silence settled over the nearby cooks as they turned to watch. Gordon crouched, scooping up the steak with exaggerated care, brushing off imaginary dust. "Still looks good to me." He held it out toward Malik. "Try it." The words hit like a slap. Malik's stomach clenched. He didn't move. "What, too good for it?" Gordon's grin widened, his voice carrying over the hum of the kitchen. "Thought you wanted to be a chef. Can't waste ingredients, right?" The others were watching, waiting. If he ate it, they would laugh. If he refused, they would push harder. Gordon stepped closer, pressing the cold meat against Malik's lips. The smell of raw blood and grease filled his nose. "Open up." Malik turned his head away, his breath coming shallow. A chuckle rumbled from Gordon's throat. "Guess you're not as hungry as I thought." The moment stretched too long. Someone muttered something Malik couldn't hear. Then, suddenly, a fist slammed into his stomach. The force sent him staggering back, pain exploding through his ribs. His knees buckled, and before he could catch himself, he collapsed onto the floor. Laughter erupted. Some clapped. A dishwasher whistled. Malik curled in on himself, trying to force air back into his lungs. The pain radiated through his core, a dull throb settling beneath his ribs. Gordon squatted beside him, still holding the steak. "See? Should have just listened the first time." Malik squeezed his eyes shut, his fingers digging into the tiles beneath him. He couldn't move. He couldn't fight back. He could only endure. Malik's ribs still ached from the punch, the pain a dull throb beneath his damp, stained shirt. The humiliation clung to him just as thickly as the filth coating his skin. He could still hear the laughter, the low murmurs of amusement from the kitchen staff as they watched him struggle to straighten up. The heat from the stoves pressed against his back, a cruel contrast to the cold sweat on his skin. His body screamed for rest, but there was no time. The night wasn't over. Owen's voice carried across the room, sharp and commanding. Enough screwing around. We're running a kitchen, not a goddamn circus. He stepped forward, arms crossed over his chest, looking down at Malik with a mixture of boredom and disdain. The smirk on his face barely hid his satisfaction. Malik swallowed hard, forcing his breathing to steady. He couldn't afford to look weak, not when they were already circling him like vultures. But his silence only seemed to amuse Owen further. "You really don't get it, do you?" Owen tilted his head, pretending to study him. "You're done here. Hell, you're done everywhere." He pulled his phone from his pocket, tapping the screen lazily before holding it up. "Just made a couple of calls. Every restaurant worth a damn in this city knows your name now." His grin widened, and not in a good way. The words hit harder than the punch to his stomach. Cooking was all he had. If that was taken away, what was left? Owen tucked his phone away, turning to the rest of the kitchen. "Now, do we waste any more time on this joke, or do we get back to work?" A few snickers rippled through the room, but no one answered. They didn't need to. The decision had already been made. A heavy hand clamped onto Malik's shoulder, fingers digging painfully into the muscle. "Travis." The security guard didn't bother with words. He yanked Malik forward, dragging him toward the back entrance. Malik barely had time to catch his footing before he was shoved through the narrow corridor leading to the alley. His pulse pounded in his ears, the humiliation burning hotter than the pain in his ribs. The door swung open, and cold air rushed in. The rain had picked up, sheets of water cascading down into the alley, turning the pavement into a slick mess of mud and grime. Malik barely had time to process the freezing wind against his skin before Travis grabbed his bag and hurled it into the storm. The knife roll hit the ground with a dull thud, the leather instantly darkening as rain soaked through. His knives, his only possessions that mattered, lay scattered in the filth. He barely had time to react before Travis shoved him forward. His foot slipped against the wet ground, and suddenly he was falling. The impact sent a sharp jolt through his already battered body, his hands scraping against the pavement. The cold was immediate, seeping through his clothes, biting into his skin like needles. A gust of wind howled through the alley, sending a violent shiver through his body. His soaked clothes clung to him like a second skin, the cold settling deep into his bones. He tried to steady his breathing, but his chest ached with each shuddering inhale. The rain poured relentlessly, soaking through Malik's clothes as he lay motionless on the cold pavement. The alley behind La Maison Royale had become his prison, a place where the weight of his failure pressed down on him like an immovable force. His breath came in short gasps, each inhale sharp against the bruises forming beneath his ribs. The cold wasn't just in the air anymore, it had seeped into his bones, numbing everything except the dull ache in his chest. The door behind him creaked open. Boots splashed against the wet ground. Laughter followed. "Still here?" The voice was mocking, filled with amusement at his misery. That was Travis. Malik forced himself to move, pushing his palms against the slick pavement. His fingers curled, aching as he braced himself to sit up. But before he could lift himself fully, a heavy boot came down on his hand. Pain shot through his knuckles, sharp and immediate. He sucked in a breath, but no sound escaped his lips. "Whoops," Travis mused, applying more pressure. "That your cutting hand?" The rain blurred his vision, but Malik could still make out the smirk on Travis's face, the amusement in his eyes, the satisfaction in breaking something that was already broken. Malik didn't beg, didn't pull away. He simply stared at his own hand pinned beneath Travis's boot, fingers pressed deep into the mud and grime. The door swung open again. More voices, more footsteps. "Look at this pathetic bastard." Owen's voice cut through the downpour, carrying easily over the sound of rain slapping against the pavement. "So desperate he won't even leave when we throw him out." Laughter rippled through the group. Some of the cooks stood beneath the awning, shielding themselves from the storm while they watched. Others stepped out into the rain, reveling in the show. Malik forced his other hand to move, fingers stretching toward the leather roll lying in the puddle beside him. The edges were soaked, the water creeping in, threatening to ruin the only things he had left. Before he could reach it, Travis shifted his weight, grinding Malik's hand harder into the gravel. A sharp hiss escaped through Malik's teeth, but he didn't fight. Owen crouched beside him, balancing effortlessly despite the rain. He grabbed the knife roll, lifting it just out of Malik's reach. "This is what you came back for." He turned it over in his hands, fingers running across the wet leather. His smirk widened. "What a waste." Malik swallowed hard, his body shaking, not just from the cold, but from the sheer helplessness of it all. Owen stood, turning to the others. "Take a good look, boys." His voice rose, commanding their attention. "This is what happens when people like him think they can be more than what they are." More laughter, more jeers. Someone muttered something about knowing your place. Another voice called him a stray dog. The knife roll slipped from Owen's hands. It landed back in the puddle with a splash, water rippling outward, soaking further into the leather. Travis finally lifted his boot. Malik slowly pulled his hand back, his fingers stiff and caked in mud. He barely felt them anymore. The group lingered a moment longer, watching, waiting for some kind of reaction. But Malik gave them nothing. Owen scoffed. "Pathetic." He turned, stepping back inside, the others following. One by one, the door shut them away, leaving Malik alone in the storm. He sat there, rain pouring over him, his body aching, his hands trembling. He didn't reach for the knives again. He just stared at them, watching the rain wash over everything he had left. A week had passed since Malik had been thrown into the storm, tossed aside like garbage. 7 days of silence, 7 days of absence. Not a single person at La Maison Royale had thought about him since. Why would they? As far as they were concerned, he had been erased, forgotten, a man who had no place in their world. But today he was back. The restaurant was packed as always, filled with a low hum of conversation, the chime of fine silverware against porcelain, the rhythmic steps of waiters gliding between tables. Everything ran like a well-oiled machine, just as it had before. Then the doors swung open. The cold afternoon air rushed inside, cutting through the warmth of the dining hall. The murmurs dipped just slightly as heads turned toward the entrance. A few guests glanced up, their curiosity piqued, but the waitstaff barely paid attention. They had work to do. Then Owen Delacroix looked up from the pass window. His smirk froze mid-command. His hand, which had been gesturing toward a dish, stopped in midair. His fingers curled slightly as his mind tried to catch up with what his eyes were seeing. Malik Langston stepped inside. But he wasn't the man they had thrown into the dirt a week ago. The soaked, broken figure in the alley was gone. In his place stood a man in a tailored black suit, crisp and untouched by the outside air. His shoes gleamed against the marble floor, his presence commanding in a way that made the room feel smaller. This wasn't a man begging for a job. This was someone who belonged here, someone who owned the very ground he walked on. And he wasn't alone. Behind him, a team followed, men in dark suits, their polished shoes barely making a sound against the floor. Lawyers, corporate executives, security. Among them, reporters clutched microphones, cameras already rolling, lenses capturing every detail. The murmurs in the dining hall turned into whispers. Someone pulled out their phone, scrolling quickly, trying to match the man standing before them to the rumors that had been circling the city for days. Owen finally snapped out of his trance, his voice cutting through the tension like a dull blade. "What the hell is this?" Malik took a slow step forward, then another. He didn't speak. He let them feel it first. The shift, the weight of his presence. Travis, standing near the host podium, looked between Malik and the suited men, his usual smug confidence faltering. Gordon wiped his hands on his apron, glancing toward the kitchen staff. But no one moved. No one knew what to do, because no one understood. Not yet. Then Malik reached into his inner pocket. He pulled out a folded document. The moment he held it up, Owen's expression twisted. "You've had your fun," Owen snapped, taking a step forward as if to shove him out the door again. "Get the hell." Malik unfolded the papers. Owen stopped. His eyes scanned the bold print, the official seals, the signatures at the bottom. His breath hitched. His jaw clenched. The words burned into his mind, undeniable, unshakable. Ownership agreement. 70% stake Malik Langston. Silence crashed over the restaurant. Malik finally spoke, his voice steady, unshaken. I own this place. A dish clattered somewhere in the back. Someone near the bar exhaled sharply. A waiter standing near the wine rack took a step back, nearly knocking over a bottle. Malik let the moment stretch, watching as realization dawned across the faces of every single person in the room. Owen, who had mocked him. Travis, who had thrown him out. The staff, who had laughed. The customers, who had looked the other way. The weight of his words settled over them like a storm. And every single one of you works for me. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. No one moved. No one spoke. The weight of Malik's words still hung in the air, pressing down on every person in the restaurant. The kitchen staff, once so quick to mock him, now stared in stunned disbelief. The servers near the dining hall exchanged uneasy glances. Even the customers, normally untouched by the chaos of the kitchen, had fallen silent, their attention locked on the man they had once ignored. Owen's face twisted, his usual arrogance flickering between rage and uncertainty. This is a joke, he spat, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. He turned sharply to the staff. Back to work. Now. No one moved. Malik took a slow step forward, his presence alone commanding the room. You don't give orders here, he said coolly. Not anymore. His gaze flicked to a suited man standing just behind him. Read it. The lawyer nodded and unfolded a second document, clearing his throat before speaking. Effective immediately, Owen Delacroix is relieved of his position as executive chef of La Maison Royale. A sharp gasp came from someone in the back. Owen's face drained of color. This is bullshit, he hissed, stepping forward as if he could physically undo what had already been sealed. You can't fire me for my own kitchen. Malik's expression didn't change. It was never yours. Owen lunged, but two security guards stepped between them, their hands hovering near their holsters. He froze, chest heaving, realization dawning in his furious eyes. There was no way out of this. Travis shifted beside him, his usual smirk long gone. He glanced around, looking for an escape, but there was none. The lawyer continued reading. Travis Holt is hereby terminated from his position as head of security, with cause effective immediately. Travis scoffed, forcing out a hollow laugh. With cause. His voice wavered slightly. For what? Malik finally looked at him, eyes cold. Assault. Harassment. Abuse of power. His voice didn't rise, but it didn't need to. And that's just the beginning. A new voice cut through the tension. Mr. Langston, may I proceed? Malik gave a single nod, and a second lawyer stepped forward, holding another document. In addition to their terminations, both Owen Delacroix and Travis Holt are facing legal action for damages. Charges include physical assault, workplace harassment, racial discrimination, and financial misconduct. Owen's eyes widened. Financial misconduct. Malik tilted his head slightly. You thought I wouldn't find out? One of the corporate representatives, a sharp-eyed woman in a tailored gray suit, stepped forward. An internal audit uncovered multiple financial discrepancies under your management, Mr. Delacroix. Her voice was professional but firm. Your personal account shows unauthorized withdrawals linked to restaurant funds, and there is evidence of tax evasion. The blood drained from Owen's face. As a result, the lawyer continued, you are being sued for $1 million in damages. A murmur rippled through the staff. The servers near the bar exchanged shocked looks. The kitchen crew, once too afraid to speak, now whispered among themselves, their gazes flickering between Owen and Malik. Travis took a step back. This is crazy. No, Malik said. What's crazy is that you thought you could get away with it. A second suited man stepped forward, this time wearing a police badge clipped to his belt. Mr. Holt, we have reviewed the footage of your actions last week. His tone was neutral, but the weight behind it was impossible to ignore. Given the evidence, you are under arrest for aggravated assault and workplace violence. The words barely had time to register before the officer grabbed Travis by the wrist, twisting his arm behind his back. "What the?" Travis struggled, but the handcuffs clicked into place. "You can't be serious." His voice cracked as panic replaced bravado. He turned to Owen, eyes wild. "Do something." Owen stood frozen. For the first time, he had no words, no commands, no way to manipulate his way out. Malik stepped closer, his voice quiet but lethal. "This isn't a kitchen prank, Travis. You don't get to laugh this off." His gaze was cold, unshaken by the man who had once crushed his hand beneath his boot. 8 years. That's what they're recommending. Travis's face contorted in horror. The officers began to pull him toward the exit. "You can't do this," he screamed, voice cracking. "This isn't fair." Malik's stare didn't waver. "Neither was what you did." Owen, still standing, still trapped in his own downfall, turned his glare back to Malik. "You think you've won?" His voice was hoarse, desperate. "You think you're better than us?" Malik didn't flinch. He simply took a step closer, lowering his voice so only Owen could hear. "I didn't have to be better," he said. "I just had to wait for you to destroy yourself." Owen's fists clenched at his sides, but there was nothing left for him to fight. He had already lost. The officers escorted Travis out the door, his protests fading into the noise of the city. Owen remained where he stood, his hands shaking slightly, his breath shallow. He wasn't in cuffs, but his sentence had already begun. Malik turned away. He had no more words for men like them. He had a restaurant to run. Owen Delacroix sat in his darkened apartment, his hands gripping the edges of his chair as he stared at the screen in front of him. The light from his laptop flickered against his pale face, illuminating the words that had been plastered across every news outlet, every blog, every culinary forum, exposing the toxic culture of LA Maison Royale. Chef Owen Delacroix under fire for racism and abuse. A shaky breath escaped his lips. His inbox had been flooded, emails from clients canceling contracts, cooking schools withdrawing invitations, restaurant owners cutting ties. His phone had been ringing nonstop, but no one was offering help. The worst of it was the video. The footage of him throwing Malik's soup onto the floor, of Travis shoving him into the alley, of his smug face as he crushed Malik's hand under his boot. It had gone viral. Millions of views. Thousands of comments. Disgusting. Hope this bastard never works again. Where's the petition to blacklist this guy from the industry? He clicked on an email from the International Culinary Association. The message was short. Effective immediately. Owen Delacroix is permanently removed from our records. Your name has been blacklisted from all affiliated organizations. You are no longer recognized as a certified executive chef. His breath caught. They had erased him. A knock on the door made him flinch. He didn't answer. He already knew what it was. Another eviction notice, another debt collector, another reminder that he had lost everything. He wasn't a chef anymore. He was nothing. Travis Holt had always thought he was untouchable. He had spent years intimidating others, using his size and authority to push people down. But in Orleans County Prison, none of that mattered. The first few days had been manageable. Then word spread. Inmates talked. Some of them had seen the video. Some of them had lived through the same kind of abuse. The first beating happened in the showers. A fist to his gut, another to his ribs. Someone grabbed him by the hair, slamming his face against the tiles. He tasted blood. The next day, it got worse. They broke his nose, then his fingers. He tried to fight back once, but that only made it worse. A week later, his left eye was gone. A punch too hard, a kick too well placed. The guards didn't care. No one did. He was no longer the one in control. He wasn't the one giving orders. Now he was just another weak body trying to survive. Food became a privilege. He ate what was left after the others had taken their share. Cold scraps, rotten bread, the same way he used to treat Malik. One night, he lay curled on the concrete floor of his cell, his body bruised and broken, his stomach twisted with hunger. No one spoke to him. No one looked at him. For the first time, he understood what it felt like to be powerless. At La Maison Royale, things had changed. The toxic presence of Owen and Travis was gone. The kitchen had been rebuilt, new leadership, new standards, a place where skill mattered more than cruelty. Malik had ensured that. He stood by the past window, watching as the team worked in sync, the sounds of knives and flames now filled with purpose rather than fear. Chef, a young line cook, hesitated beside him. Table 9 sent their compliments. They said it's the best meal they've had all year. Malik nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Good. Let's keep it that way. He turned toward the dining hall, his gaze sweeping across the polished floors, the candlelit tables, the satisfied faces of guests enjoying the very restaurant he had built. Justice had been served, and he had taken back everything they tried to steal from him. The end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more thrilling content. What do you think about Owen and Travis's punishment? Do you think they got what they deserved, or should it have been even worse? Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching, YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, or anywhere else, so we can discuss it together.